Okay, welcome everyone. In the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get started here. Probably have some folks, again, just kind of trickling in as we get started. But we want to welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of our research webinar series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, and Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, as well as MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students, as well as improve student achievement. Before we introduce today's webinar, introduce today's presenters, just a quick disclaimer about today's webinar. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including the chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. So we'll take just a minute now to introduce our presenters. First, we have with us Jason W. Richardson, who's an associate professor in the Department of Educational Leadership Studies at the University of Kentucky. He's also the director of online teaching and learning for the College of Education at the University of Kentucky. Jason possesses a Bachelor's of Science in Mathematics Education with a minor in Spanish from Indiana University-Purdue University, Indianapolis, a Master's of Science degree in Curriculum and Instruction with a focus on international and intercultural education, and a PhD in Educational Policy and Administration with a focus on comparative and international development education from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. He has previously taught mathematics on the Navajo Reservation in Arizona, as well as in inner-city Indianapolis, and currently teaches educational leadership, emerging technologies, and technology leadership at the graduate level. He's also the director of online teaching and learning for the College of Education at the University of Kentucky. We also have with us Dr. Dennis Beck, who is an assistant professor of educational technology at the University of Arkansas. He enjoys teaching courses in instructional design, integrating technology into the curriculum, and educational technology research. He also has a wealth of experience in the design of online and blended courses and educational and corporate training environments. He has published in several other venues, including Computers in Education, American Journal of Distance Education, Educational Administration Quarterly, the Journal of Educational Research, and the Journal of Virtual Worlds Research. With that, I will turn it over to our presenters. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And want to also say that Dr. LaFrance will be joining us shortly. I think he's having a little technical difficulties getting on. So I just want to make sure. Justin, can you hear me okay? Hello, Justin?
Yeah, you're coming in clear, Dennis.
Perfectly clear, yeah.
Great. Just making sure before I start. I wanted to thank everybody for coming. And so to give you a little bit of background about our study, it was sponsored by an Southeastern Conference travel grant where I received some funding to travel to the University of Kentucky and to work with Dr. Richardson. And then also we had already known Dr. LaFrance, Jason LaFrance, already at Georgia Southern at the time, and now at Florida Southern. And in the two weeks that I spent at the University of Kentucky, I had a really great opportunity to meet with a lot of their students in the technology leadership program, as well as interact with the faculty there. And we kind of came up with a couple different research ideas, and the main one of which is what this particular study came out of, and it resulted in us interviewing some virtual school leaders. And so with that, I'll kind of get into this. So the first the first thing that we kind of came up with here was, what was our problem? What was our need? And that was, how do people attain jobs in virtual schools in leadership? I myself am kind of going through this right now. I'm president of the school board for a fully online school in Arkansas. So what are the qualifications that you need? What are the differences in virtual school leadership and brick and mortar school leadership? How can the field better prepare these folks as well? So that was kind of some of the main questions we had for that. And our main questions that kind of came there, you can see 1 and 1A was, what dispositions help these folks get the job? And then how is the job different that they experience than a brick and mortar school? A little bit about our methods. We used Advanced Ed, which is an accrediting organization. They have a list of 130 accredited public virtual schools or programs in the United States. 32 of those schools and programs were within the same district, or the school program no longer existed. So those were eliminated from our list. And so therefore we had a list of, I think it's 98, if I'm doing my math right, that we used. We found 3 rounds of email. We did 3 rounds of email sent directly and personally to the 98 school leaders. And then the researchers, that's us 3, followed up each with a non-response with a telephone call. And that involved getting through several layers of gatekeepers, as you can imagine, with some school leaders. 6 of the school leaders that we actually got in contact refused to participate in the study. And the reasons for refusal included things like requiring they wanted a stipend. One person wanted a stipend to participate. Someone else was too busy to participate. And the most, though, is that participation required permission from the school district. And that, I think, was due to backlash on some negative studies on virtual schools. We were uncertain, though, about how many emails or telephone calls did not reach the appropriate person. A little bit about our methods. We had about an 18.3% response rate, which was actually 18 interviewees, coincidentally. And we really consider those 18 participants to be key informants as defined by Patton, since their schools represented a sample that demonstrated a certain level of quality as being accredited by Advanced Ed. Some of those that did not respond were probably dead addresses, email addresses, because of how mobile virtual school leaders can be. We had interviews between 45 and 60 minutes that were recorded, and semi-structured telephone interviews. The protocol was developed through modifying interview protocols from previous published studies that investigated school leadership in special populations, mainly developed by Dr. Richardson here and his colleagues. A little bit about the limitations. First, the population consisted of virtual school leaders as identified on the Advanced Ed website as of April 2013. Thus, the population is not inclusive of all public virtual school programs in the United States. It's only those on the Advanced Ed website. Second, the research was limited to the perceptions of a select number of virtual school leaders. And so their perceptions, beliefs, and experiences were self-reported, and thus the data cannot be verified. Third, our results are limited by the small sample. It limits the breadth and diversity of our results, as is evident as you'll see, the types of virtual schools vary dramatically. Thus, the number of instances of each type of virtual school may lead to overgeneralizations. A little bit about the school leader demographics. Most had very little experience as a traditional administrator. You can see the highlighted things there on this particular slide. So their comparisons were based more on their interactions with brick and mortar persons than their own experience. They also had very little experience as a virtual school administrator. A third had a year or less experience, half had 2 years or less. 7 out of 18 had 3 to 5 years experience, and only 2 had 8 to 11 years of experience. A little bit about the the geography of it. Utah, Minnesota, and Florida and Washington accounted for half the interviews. And I think it's important to note that those are states that are considered very cyber-friendly and charter-friendly environments. Half of the schools were fully online, and a half were supplementary, where they provided some online and some face-to-face courses. 10 out of 18 enrollments were 500 or less. 4 out of 18 were between 1,000 and 1,600, and 4 out of 18 were considered large, anywhere from mid 3,000s to 13,000. So answers might be more weighted towards smaller school leadership, and we'll highlight those different areas as we present. As you can see here, most had very little experience as a traditional administrator, so their comparisons were based more on their interactions with brick and mortar people, and mortar peers, sorry, than their own experience. A lot of them had very little experience as a virtual school administrator as well, as you can see. See if this is going correctly. Let me, I forgot to go through all these, I apologize. All right, and that brings us to the data analysis, which we used a constant comparative method, and what we did is our final coding phase occurred in 3 rounds, where each researcher coded a subset of the 18 interviews until we had coded every transcript. Thus, each transcript was coded by one researcher, then confirmed or rejected by 2 different researchers. And at the conclusion of each round, the inter-rater reliability was calculated. Excuse me. I'm a bit under the weather. Jason?
All right, I'm Jason. Again, this project was really couched in an exploratory study trying to really understand what it's like to be a virtual school leader. So you'll see in the notes pod on the bottom right that we got 2 studies out of this where we looked at this idea of how do they get their job, which we're talking about now, but also challenges. If you want to read about those, feel free to take a look at those articles. So when we looked at these dispositions, so how did they actually land this job of being a virtual school leader, we found that there were 4 key dispositions: being flexible, innovative, being tech savvy, being an instructional leader, being a communicator, and being a collaborator. So let's look at what they said with regards to this. So with this first finding, some of our participants, one noted that cyberschooling is much like traveling to Mars. It's something that hasn't been done before, so they're really having to build the ship as it moves, so to speak. And they're also knowing that in online learning and in online schooling that things are going to be changing frequently. So they had to be comfortable with that. So on their CVs, they had to have experiences that show that they were flexible as well as innovative and okay with change. Here's another quote talking about how change was really going to be inevitable. So no matter what, they had to be on board for that. If that be the technology, be the pedagogy, be teachers, students, that the change is going to be coming at them rapidly. One principal talked about how the district really needed somebody who was going to be creative and innovative. So being a school leader in virtual schools really required that kind of a disposition. And they really talked about this notion of ambiguity, that we really can't say where cyberschooling is going to be, 6 months or 12 months or 18 months from now. So next year might look totally different. So they had to be okay with jumping on board and leading that charge. Another one of the key dispositions is that they had to be tech savvy. I've also done studies on superintendents who won tech savvy awards. What was kind of interesting is they didn't need to be tech savvy, but they needed to be tech savvy aware. But for virtual school leaders, we found that they did indeed have to be tech savvy. So they had to know how to leverage the technology, because that was really a big part of cyberschooling, because of course it's being delivered through technology, so that makes sense. But they talk about this whole idea of tech literacy, understanding what it's like to be a teacher in these as well as a student in these kind of courses, had to be at the forefront of one of their dispositions. They had to have a vision around the needs of the digital generation. So they really were tapping into digital citizenship and trying to really understand what it's like to be a 21st century kid, being totally connected and always on, and what does that mean for learning. They also had to know that technology would come at them quickly, and they can't really be wowed with the new stuff and just jump on board to any new innovation that comes their way. So they really had to be understanding that the reality is just teaching kids, and the technology is just the medium through which the instruction is coming, which is, of course, being an instructional leader. So when they were talking about landing the position, they were talking about reflecting back on that job hiring process. They said that there was really a preference for candidates that didn't have any school leadership, and that's what Dennis showed you. But they were experienced with taking online courses or taking an online degree or heading up other online initiatives. So one of the leaders talked about if you want to be a virtual school leader, one thing you really need to do, of course, is learn about tech. And it's true. My area is school technology leadership, and a lot of admin just really aren't familiar with technology, and they really might have a negative feeling about it, or they put it towards their chief tech officer or for a tech coach, but they don't really embrace it themselves. Another one of these virtual school leaders talked about how they were really championing a blended model learning in their state before it was even a popular term. So being a vanguard in that regard was one of those dispositions. I hinted at it earlier, but this notion of instructional leadership was a really big disposition. These leaders really need to focus on the learning part of cyberschooling or virtual schooling. I know we use those two terms interchangeably, so please forgive us. But cyberschool leaders really need to have a strong foundation in curriculum standards as well as the pedagogy and instruction. And you have to really understand that online programs are different than brick and mortar programs. There's a lot of literature out there about how do we evaluate our students. Should it be the same evaluation metrics? Should we be evaluating our teachers the same? So these leaders were saying, no, there's actually some nuanced differences that really need to be taken into account here. And that's our third point here, is that you need to understand that best practices in an online environment are really different than that's when we teach face-to-face. So trying to understand those and discern those is really important as a school leader. And even this notion of instructional leadership, how that is a disposition that's even much more important than tech skills. So these folks had to be able to demonstrate that they were instructional leaders in their traditional brick and mortar environment before they get these kind of jobs. And another school leader here talked about how it was really important to be able to translate the curriculum into an online environment. Of course, how do we do that with good instructional design techniques and trying to understand how we translate that from a face-to-face into online. So another person talked about being a curriculum director. So again, it's that focus on the curriculum and instruction. So being an instructional leader there. And another person was hired because they were auditing curriculum. So if you were able to audit it, maybe you're able to implement it and audit your own school a little bit better. And another one here was talking about having innovative approaches to curriculum and development. And again, that gets at our point of being a good instructional leader. Another one of those aspects that they were referring to is I went ahead one slide. There it is. Sorry, I thought that jumped ahead. Another one of those dispositions is they had to be really strong communicators and they had to be strong collaborators. Randy's asking a question about, did anyone mention about being an online teacher first? Yeah, some of the folks did, and that's where they said they got their instruction or their online experiences. But to be honest, some of them were just merely students in online courses, so they knew what it was like on the receiving end. So they didn't actually have to be an online teacher, but some of them did, but that was by no means a major finding. So good question, Randy. So again, this finding on communication, of course, we all know that when we're communicating via email or communicating in online environments, that's really important that we're tight and succinct with our words because, in synchronous environments, they can get misconstrued. So they talked about how communication had to be really well thought out. that your writing has to be really precise. You have to be very accurate. You have to worry about how that's going to be filtered through the receiver here. And even communicating that vision through a writing or a video platform was even more important. So in brick and mortar schools, the vision can be espoused in lots of different ways, through community meetings or through face-to-face or through the walkthroughs of the school. But in a cyber school is a lot different. So we had to really focus on how do you communicate that. And these leaders had to have a clear vision of that. As cyber school leaders really need to think about growth of students. They talked about how the numbers could jump up or jump down quite quickly, as well as teachers. So teachers are a fluid factor in online courses, so you might have to hire up really quickly. So you have to be thinking about that. So if you all of a sudden need 10 new teachers, you have to be able to figure out who are you going to tap into to get that. On the notion of collaborating, they talked about how collaborating with their peers, with other virtual school leaders was really important because you really needed to know how to play the game, because cyberschooling is a very political venture, as Dennis can attest to. So they had to understand who to talk to and how to get things done within that kind of an environment. And again, someone here was talking about that idea of a vision, but it's also the ability to be able to build rapport. It's a very political game. So they had to be able to build rapport with the staff, with teachers, with people in the state, and do so rather quickly. Our second question looked at what are some of these big differences. So the text is a little bit small there, but we're going to focus on the 4 on the left, which are some of the 4 biggest ones. We've had all these differences as far as interacting with students was different. Teacher supervision was different. PD was different. Day-to-day operations is different. Policies are different. Curriculum development, as well as delivering instruction, recruiting, interacting with parents, budgets, and legal and ethical issues. Those were all differences also, but again, the 4 big ones here are the ones we'll be addressing today. And these all came up organically. We didn't necessarily suggest these. We just asked an open-ended question: what are some of the differences of leading a brick and mortar school, versus a virtual school? So that's where we got those. So one of the big issues was interacting with students. This was a big difference. They talked about how discipline's much different. You just can't pull a student aside. So you have to be able to figure out how discipline in that environment is going to work. They also talked about how communicating, you had to communicate more with students. In a brick and mortar school, you might be able to avoid a lot of students, or students might be able to avoid you, but they can't really do that in a brick and mortar or in a virtual school because of text messaging or online communication. It's all going to be there. It's all going to be a record. And again, this whole idea of written communication is really vital, especially with students, right? So how do leaders then communicate with their students? It has to be very clear and concise. Teacher supervision was another one that was rather large. They said that actually being online made their job much easier. That they can take a lot more, a bigger in-depth approach to teacher evaluation. So it's not just a 20-minute stop in once a semester to see how a teacher's doing. They can pop in whenever they want into these courses, or they can look at the logs, or they can look at the recorded interactions. And they found that they spend a lot more time supervising, evaluating, and looking at data about teachers over a longer period of time. They really found that to be a really plus, a really positive aspect of being an online learner, a leader. Because again, right here, they said there's a virtual footprint for everything that a teacher does, which is actually one of those things we didn't really quite give much thought to, but it makes a lot of sense. And nearly all of the leaders talked about how this was much easier part of their job. And they said that they're able to also, of course, observe student interactions, which they can't really do a lot in a brick and mortar school, except for during that time when they pop their head into the classrooms. But here we have a lot of snapshots of how the teachers are interacting with the teachers. PD, delivering PD to teachers, was also viewed as being different. So they talked a lot about how they were able to differentiate a lot of PD to the needs of their teachers. They all don't need to go to the local school district office and do the exact same PD, but they can actually send them off to different types of PD on their own based on their needs as well as their interests. And they're also able to track these folks a lot better to see what they did and see what kind of outcomes and outputs they had from some of this differentiated PD for their teachers. They also talk about how being a leader is also in a cyber school is also about having a lot more control over a greater number of variables. For example, talk about innovation and talking about these pods of innovation where really cool things happen. They say they can easily have a group of teachers do it, and they can easily figure out who's doing what and monitor that and see what's working and measure that much quicker than if it were in a traditional brick and mortar school where cool things might be happening, but it's much harder to know if it's happening or to monitor what's actually happening. So here they were saying it's much easier to watch these things and see incubators of innovation happening. They talked about how day-to-day operations were also different in a cyber school. When asked how, they talked about you don't have a lot of things that are taking your time over to person A or person B. So you can really develop a plan for the week and pretty much stick with it. So they're talking about how they were able to be a lot much more consistent. They're talking about resources was another big issue that you have to really think through. They have to think if they're going to be delivering books to students, which that was a challenge with the AP courses, but they said they really tried to build their own textbooks so they don't have to worry about those sort of things. So they're able to deal with those sort of resource delivery much differently. This little arrow seems to go for double click each time, so I apologize for that. And they also mentioned how they were much more data driven because they were able to watch all the interactions. They were able to figure out what's going on with students, with teachers. They're able to then give out the right messages to try to figure out exactly where the problem was. So one of the leaders really talked about this notion of having a predictive analytics to try to figure out really what's going on with students and try to give them the best experiences that they can. So that was really cool. I'll let Dennis come in and finish us up with some of the implications of this study and what it might mean for you all in the greater community. Nope, he's having a little bit of coughing fit here. I guess heard from our colleague Jason Lafranis, and he's having an issue right now. He's getting called into a meeting with the dean, so he apologizes.
Can you hear me now? I'm back. Great. So yes, a little bit about the implications. And so what we found out is that the job of a virtual school leader is different in a variety of nuanced ways. First of all, woven throughout the differences is the notion that technology can really transform how leaders interact with students, how leaders evaluate, how they supervise, how they professionally develop their teachers, how leaders operate on a day-to-day basis. As was evident from the virtual school leaders in this study, in particular, technology enhanced their abilities to focus on instructional leadership in their day-to-day operations in ways that were not afforded to a traditional brick and mortar environment. Technology enabled the leaders to gain a more comprehensive contextual picture of the growth and needs of their instructors and students. And that, in a way, is something that is, I think, generalizable to a lot of brick and mortar schools, just with increased blended environments and recorded lectures and that sort of thing that leaders can look in on, and the focus on data in the K-12 environment anymore. It's likely student achievement and student engagement would potentially be positively impacted by providing customized just-in-time feedback to teachers by the leaders. That's something that we want to look at in future research. It's perhaps the most transferable of all the lessons I mentioned. As the technology becomes increasingly ubiquitous in the schools, really leaders need to find better ways to use technology as a mechanism to increase quality of instruction. Let's see, let me go to the next slide. So a little bit about that was implications kind of for the role differences. A little bit on their mindset, their skills. I think one of the things, and this is hopefully Randy Levanti, hopefully going to address your question. Leaders need to be flexible and adaptable. This need has been noted in brick and mortar schools as well, and being adaptable to changing needs of a cyber school, whether it's technological, pedagogical, human resources, cultural, whatever needs, requires a leader who doesn't shy away from change. So I guess you might say that's a difference in degree. I think also, though, Cyberschool leaders need to have some degree of technology savviness. And once again, this could be a potential requirement here that I think you're seeing a lot more that leaders are being asked. Have you taught online? Have you taken classes online? Things like that. Having those past experiences seem to be a very essential experience. Really having a strong understanding of curriculum and standards and instruction, important as well. But also soft skills, and I mentioned kind of the ability to be flexible and adaptable, but also just being good communicators and collaborators, given that most interactions by Cyberschool leaders are done electronically, really being a focus there on written communication and message design. So more so than for traditional school leaders. A little bit about the different job. Technology can transform how leaders interact with students, how leaders evaluate, how they supervise, how they professionally develop their teachers, how leaders operate on a day-to-day basis. It can be used to focus on instructional leadership in their day-to-day operations in ways that they're not easily afforded in brick-and-mortar environments. In our case, it enabled these Cyberschool leaders to gain a comprehensive and contextual picture of the growth and needs of their instructors and students. And the leaders of the schools discussed being able to provide customized, just-in-time feedback that teachers could implement immediately. A few recommendations. First of all, potential future research studies really need to investigate motivators for pursuing this career path of a virtual school leader, how leaders are chosen from the hiring agent's perspective, whether the roles were filled by appointment, volunteering, or external formal candidate search, and whether those with non-cyber experience preferred being a cyber leader or a brick-and-mortar leader. The field of ed leadership is one of those things that will be better served by understanding the career path of these sorts of cyber leaders, not just with the obviously exploding cyber school field and the number of cyber schools and the enrollment in cyber schools, but with blended learning as well. And based on the literature, our experience in ed leadership programs, and the findings from this study, as well as previous research I did with Dr. LaFrance, it's really evident that pre-service ed leadership programs are not, overall, there are a few bright spots, but they're not meeting the needs of modern digitally infused schools, especially cyber schools. And so university leadership programs really need to be addressing those needs of the field by incorporating online learning experiences into the curriculum and mandating things like cyber school internships and focusing on differences that leaders will experience if they pursue a traditional leadership or a cyber school leadership position. That's it for our presentation. We kind of open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you both. We'll obviously leave a few minutes here for folks to type in questions in the chat box. I had kind of a general question. I know we talked a little bit about professional development and kind of the different avenues or methods folks might use in a cyber setting for that. What about, did you have any findings around like staffing practices, how leaders might go about filling new roles, creating new roles within their own settings, and how that might differ from, say, a brick and mortar environment? Jason, I think you may be muted if you're
I was, sorry. No one mentioned that specifically. Actually, they mentioned probably the counter to that, as far as their pool of teachers could be a little bit larger. So they still had to be state certified, but they didn't necessarily need to live in the geographic area. So they were talking about how they can easily get teachers from all over the state or even out of the state that had the certification. So for them, they said it was easier to get better teachers because the pool was just much more, much larger.
And Diane, I wanted to address your question. We're not currently doing any long-term studies, but it's a great idea for future research to really focus on and asking some of these folks to chart their development in their first few years of their jobs, how their learning progressed. It's a good idea.
Yeah, that would be a really strong idea there, Diane, is actually to say, so you've been in this job now for a while, because as you saw from the demographic data that were presented, these folks were relatively newbies into the field. So it'd be interesting to say, so what have you learned now? What kind of nuggets of wisdom would you like to pass on? So that'd be a great idea. Yeah, good point. Diane, we cover some of that in our challenges of virtual school leadership in that article that we have on the bottom. And some of that was preparation challenges.
And
It would be
Jason, I
interesting
think
to
we
say
also have some
what we do.
Jason, don't we also have some unanalyzed data on that as well?
Yeah, we do.
Also, we just haven't gotten to that yet.
And Randy asked a question about differences in context versus leadership requirements. You're 100% right, Randy. They weren't necessarily, these are skills that traditional leaders might have also, but these were leadership requirements that they thought were much more accentuated in the online context, and those skills need to be much further honed versus anywhere else. And again, this is their self-reporting, so we didn't necessarily ask them. We were just saying, you know, what are some of those skills and dispositions that you think that got you to land this job? Those sort of questions. Any other questions? I see Jason LaFrance is on here also. If he wants to pop in, feel free.
Jason, you want to make a few comments? You have to click the little microphone button at the top to talk.
No worries, Jason. Yeah, we really feel that this area of virtual school leadership is really ripe right now. Not too many people are actually looking at that. And I know that Dennis and Jason both did a study looking at internships in cyber schools. And those are one of those things we really don't have, or preparation into that role. We just don't have a lot of mechanisms for that yet. So people are going through traditional programs and then hoping to top up their skills. That's what we feel this kind of study is really needed to say, are our preparation programs, which would be another tangential study, meeting some of these needs of virtual school leaders? And maybe we need to extend this study beyond the advanced ed and look at some of these other schools, maybe different charter schools or something of that sort. All right, thank you, Diane. We appreciate it. Thanks for the questions.
Yes, thank you very much for the questions, everybody.
We will allow for just a little bit more time for some questions. So if you have any other questions for our presenters, please feel free to use the chat window there. Also want to make mention again of the references that are included in the bottom right of the screen, the notes pod there. You can see the studies which were the basis of our presentation today. So be sure to head over to those references and read the studies themselves.
You know, anecdotally speaking, having sat in on a few different interviews of online school leaders, and I can say that there's, at least in our group, a kind of a discussion between, do we want someone who is technically savvy with everything and that it knows how things run, but perhaps not as much leadership experience, or somebody with a ton of leadership experience, and is technologically competent, but is someone that is really well connected in the state politically, or well connected in the state in different areas of the state with different educators and leaders. That's kind of it's somewhat of a false dichotomy, but it was somewhat of the discussion that we had. So I just kind of offer that up.
Yeah, and Jason LaFrance hits on a really important part about how our traditional programs are not preparing leaders for leading with technology. So to being instructional leaders or technology use for themselves or diffused throughout their organization. I'm also a director for the Advanced Study of Technology, Leadership, and Education, and that's what we focus on how do we get school leaders to tap into the power of technology and to know what to be looking for. So what are good practices for themselves as well as teachers and students. So that's a huge area, a huge field that's still developing now. So good point, Jason.
Okay, just want to echo Catherine's comment to Jason, and Dennis about sharing the work as it comes in. Obviously, you've got that chunk of unanalyzed data, and you've got a lot of things that you can work with and further explore. So we want to welcome you guys to present on any of the work that might further come of this. So we, again, really appreciate you taking the time to present it to us today. Just a few more things before we wrap up. I just want to make mention about a couple of our ongoing initiatives here at the Institute. We have a podcast series and a guest blogger program. So for anyone interested in either of those initiatives, you can click the URLs there to learn more about our podcast. You can listen to it. If you're interested in becoming a guest, you can reach out to us directly and come and share some of your stories in our podcast as well as our blog platform. We also want to make mention of our upcoming webinar on Wednesday, April 6th at 2 p.m. We'll be hearing from some folks from the EDC as part of a REL Midwest study on meeting the needs of online teachers. We actually have one of our presenters in the audience with us today, Aaron. So please feel free to come back and join us and learn more about some of the needs of online teachers. And again, as we've talked about today, some of those needs around training and the challenges that are included. In the meantime, if you have any feedback for us about our webinar series or any of our work, you can reach us by email. You can sign up for our mailing list by clicking the link there. You can visit us on our social platforms at Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn by clicking those URLs or visiting those handles. And then you can find the recordings of all of our webinars, including this one, probably within 24 or 48 hours on our YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/MVLRI1. And to look at all of our upcoming webinars as well as all of our archived webinars, you can visit our own website, mvlri.org/presentations/webinars. Very quickly before I go, I just wanted to share a couple quick polls about